Okay, welcome everybody to the People's Water Board Water Wednesday. Very, very happy to be on today with Jerry Goldberg. He works with the Party for Socialism and Liberation. Also, he's one of the attorneys that fought against the water shutoffs and the lawsuit that was brought against with the bankruptcy and things like that. I'm messing that up, I feel like. But I'm really, really glad that you're here because we wanted to talk about the bankruptcy and some of the history of the bankruptcy in Detroit and kind of how we ended up where we are here today in this conversation. It's really important that people understand what happened in the past, especially in 2014, to kind of understand what's happening now today. So thank you for being on with us. And thank you for everybody joining us. Please share this out and leave some comments and we'll be responding to those. So welcome, Jerry.
Thank you. Welcome to you. And thank you very much for this invitation. I'm always anxious to talk about the bankruptcy and the role of the banks because so much of that is covered up, especially to the youth today, who many of whom were very young when the whole attack on Detroit perpetrated by the banks that led to the bankruptcy occurred. And it's hard to, you don't have that historical perspective that you need really to move forward in the struggle. So if you'd like me to begin, I can begin if you'd like.
Yeah. Give us some background.
Sure, let me give some background on the bankruptcy. Just to say, I moved into Detroit in 1970 as a radical youth who was in SDS. When I moved to Detroit was, of course, it was a revolutionary cauldron. It was a place where really the Black liberation struggle was really at its peak. And the reason was there were so many young African-American workers in the auto plants who had the power to shut down production. And the League of Revolutionary Black Workers brought to those plants the revolutionary perspective that existed during that day of groups like the Panthers and themselves that really were part of the world struggle and brought it right into the working class. And Detroit was unique from that point of view. Unfortunately, in the from 1979 to 1982, when the auto companies launched the major restructuring of auto and eliminated about half their jobs, what they did is they used that as an opportunity to basically destroy the power of young Black workers in the auto plants. And in that 3-year period, Chrysler eliminated about 35,000 auto jobs right in the city, most of whom were African-American workers. And it had really a devastating effect on the city. And after that, the capitalists basically had almost an economic boycott of Detroit for many years. And Detroit went from being a vital place for young Black workers where you could find jobs into, really a center of poverty. But even with that, Detroit always remained a city of neighborhoods. And it was a city where African Americans particularly owned homes. And we had the highest Black home ownership rate of any city in the country right into the 2000s. And actually there was a slight recovery in the economy in Detroit in the 2000s. And our neighborhoods were intact. It's so important. When people see Detroit now, they see row after, block after block of blighted homes and emptied blocks. That wasn't the Detroit that existed into the 2000s. We were a city of neighborhoods where African Americans owned homes. And then what happened in the mid-2000s, the banks came in with their subprime mortgage scheme, and really was a way to really, I think credit cards had maxed out, so they were looking for a new way to make money off their predatory lending schemes. And literally what they did is they targeted particularly African-American and Latino homeowners, and they would send people into the neighborhoods. They would go up to a home, might be owned by a senior citizen who paid off the home, a $10,000, $20,000 home. Say, hey, you need a new roof. No problem. We'll just rewrite your loan. We'll give you a new loan and you'll have plenty of money to fix your roof. But of course, unfortunately, those loans were predatory loans and they were based on adjustable rates where the first year, the homeowner might pay $500 a month. But by the third year, they were paying $1,500 a month because the rate adjusted homeowner. And these were people that had fixed incomes, and I represented many of them along with Vanessa Fluker, and it led to a massive foreclosures in the city. From 2005 to 2010, we had 65,000 bank foreclosures in the city of Detroit. 98% of them were based on these predatory, racist loans brought by the banks. And people always ask who were the good banks. There weren't any. Every one of them got involved because what happened was they would bundle these subprime loans, sell them as security instruments on Wall Street, and the rate of profit on these securities were 8 times greater than the rate on fixed rate mortgages. So it was irresistible to them. And literally it destroyed our city in many ways. It drove a quarter of the population of Detroit out. And we became what we are now. And then, of course, the property tax foreclosures followed in their wake because part of the subprime lending fiasco was they would value homes that nothing related to their actual value, and it led to the property taxes again. And what's important is the government stepped in and they bailed out these banks. Actually, they nationalized Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, which was like a governmental agency that backed up mortgage loans. And so when the banks foreclosed on the homes, they would pay the banks, they would get the full value of the mortgages paid by the government. Then the federal government would take them over. And actually the federal government did most of the evictions from foreclosures. And that was, unfortunately, that was during the Obama years, the Obama-Biden years. I mean, I'm not saying it began with Bush, but it continued. And that's important to know. When this happened, of course, when you lose a quarter of your population, the financial situation in the city obviously becomes devastating. So then the city, Detroit, had to issue these bonds to fund the pensions. They were called pension obligation certificates. And when they issued about $1.5 billion in bonds, but the banks came in on these bonds and they turned them into predatory loans. The bonds were usually adjustable rate bonds, meaning the interest rate would go up or down depending on what the Federal Reserve interest rate was. And so the banks came in and said, we'll give you we'll sell you interest rate swaps. And you pay us a fixed rate on the bonds around 5%, and we'll pay the adjustable rate. And whoever's ahead at the end of that year, based on that, has to pay the other one back. And when they did that, the fixed rate and adjustable rate was about the same. But within 5 years, because of the bank fraud and because of the part of the bailout of the banks was to reduce interest rates to 0. So suddenly the banks are making an extra $50 million a year off these predatory loans to the city. And it put the city into debt, into massive debt. And it was just an extent, and so really was them benefiting from their own fraud. And they knew what they were doing. The ratings agencies backed them up. And then they could declare a termination event if the bond rating went down. They declared the termination event. They would go to the city and say, well, you owe us the entire difference. Whoever's ahead has to pay that out over a period for 30 years. And that's really what precipitated the bankruptcy, was when they came to the city, said, well, bankruptcy was actually an emergency management was one of the things that triggered these termination fees. And they came to the city, said, you owe us $400 million, pay up. And that's what led to the bankruptcy. There's no question. And these are corrupt these swaps. And a lot of people think they were just a product of the corruption of Kwame Kilpatrick, but really these were done all over the country, all over the world. It wasn't a particular administration. They were the agencies of finance capital that imposed these. Literally, Puerto Rico had $72 billion on similar loans. And really every city and almost every municipal bankruptcy was triggered by them. And it was just a pattern, and it was the pattern of corruption of the system. Well, the same thing happened in water. Just as, again, when the population goes down, the collections go down of fees. So the water department issued many bonds themselves. And in 2000, and over the years, and their bonds also were tied to these interest rate swaps. And if people, there's a really good film called The Big Short. It's a Hollywood movie, but it was with Brad Pitt and them. It describes the process pretty well, and I would recommend it for people. So what happened in Detroit with the water bonds is they did the exact same thing. In 2011 and 2012, the water department issued about $1.2 billion in bond payments. Those bond payments, $537 million of the 1.2 billion was to pay off crooked interest rate swaps to the banks. About 200 million went for infrastructure repair. So I always think about that when the water collapses. Why is our infrastructure? Well, one of the reasons is the bank stole all the funds that were supposed to be used for infrastructure repair. And which banks? They were, every bank was involved. There's a whole list. Let me say, I pulled the list today. It was Chase, UBS, Morgan Stanley, SBS Financial. It was literally every bank. Goldman Sachs issued them. So that's a lot what led to the bankruptcy in Detroit. It was these crooked bond deals imposed by the banks on the city and also imposed by the banks on the water department. And there's no question about it. And this was it was a criminal, it was literally a criminal conspiracy by the banks in their drive for profit that was sanctioned by the government at all levels and that they got away with. And we fought it and we exposed it when we started doing the foreclosure work. And I intervened in the bankruptcy, and we actually had a trial about the interest rate swaps in the bankruptcy. And I was the only people that was me and the insurance lawyers who had to pay all for the bondholders. I was with them in the trial, but I was the one who really put the city on trial. It was my proudest moment as a lawyer. I've been activist first and a lawyer second. I did it for free, but I had a chance to grill Orr and all of them about how can you reward these banks for what they've done to the city. Right. And in fact, Rhodes, because of the impact of this, actually lowered the swaps fairly significantly, though not that significantly. He did it for a while, and he did it to gain some credibility in the bankruptcy. He later said that was the thing that gave him the most credibility in the bankruptcy. And it was really a product of the struggle. We were out there picketing every day, calling for canceling the debts, and Moratorium Now led many of these demonstrations along with the retirees who of course paid for it. In fact, the bankruptcy in Detroit, of the debt the bankruptcy in Detroit ended up liquidating about $7 billion in debt, or dealing with $7 billion. Almost all of that came out of the retirees. 78% of the debt was paid by the retirees by lowering their pensions and taking away their health care. And only a very small percentage of bond debt was even dealt with in the bankruptcy whatsoever.
The people didn't even matter. They
mattered not at all. And when I get to the water, you really get a picture of how little they mattered. But no question about it. And that was what the bankruptcy was for. Emergency management. When the emergency manager first came in Moratorium Now, we studied the bill, and what we saw in the bill was the emergency manager was empowered to really remove and renegotiate every single contract, but he had to pay the debt service to the banks. So really, emergency managers were agents of Wall Street, and they were the direct control by Wall Street and the financial institutions over the city. And we pointed that out from day one. Many of the groups opposed emergency management based on the fact that it was a denial of the right of self-determination, taking away elected officials, and it was racist to the core, and it was directed against Black cities. But also, what at the core of it was not just racism, but the other aspect of it was that it was for the direct rule of the banks. But under Michigan law, you couldn't go after pensions. They were guaranteed under the Michigan Constitution. You couldn't impair public pensions. And that's why they had to go into the bankruptcy. The bankruptcy was about going after the pensions. And that's really what it was about. That was the main thing it was about.
Under the bus,
And the first decision of the bankruptcy was whether he could do that. And the judge's first ruling was because federal law, which bankruptcy is under, supersedes state law. The Michigan constitutional ban on going after pensions did not apply in a bankruptcy. And that's why they went into bankruptcy. With regard to the water, the other aspect of the bankruptcy was to facilitate the takeover of initially they were looking to privatize the water, or was approaching Veolia and other companies to directly privatize. But they decided instead to create the GLWA as a regional authority and to really deprive Detroit of its control of the water department. And they used the bankruptcy to doing that for the same reason. The Michigan Constitution requires that if you're going to sell off a utility in a publicly owned utility, you have to submit it to a vote of the people. But in bankruptcy, they didn't have to do that. And that was the other aspect of it. With regard to the GLWA, as I said, the water department had issued all these bonds that were tied also to the interest rates, or they're completely corrupt. And during the bankruptcy, I actually found an attorney that would have sued to recover those funds, recover that $537 million, and went to Wolfson, the head of GL, said, why don't you go after the banks for the way they stole the money? But he wasn't interested in hearing that. They were interested in turning over the system to the GLWA. Part of the GLWA, though, in order to create the regional authority, they actually took over the DWSD, the Water Department, Detroit Water bond debt. But the condition for taking over the bond debt was the water shutoffs. In other words, the water shutoffs were necessary because the regional authority, wanted a guarantee that they could get the funds to pay off the bonds, and their way to do it was to shut off. So mass water shutoffs were completely part of the bankruptcy. They were part of the bankruptcy to guarantee the bondholders, in order for GLWA to take over. So I always keep that in mind. Every water shutoff was a shutoff on behalf of the banks. During the bankruptcy, we had an incredible trial. There was a trial on interest rate swaps that I prepared, but there was a wonderful trial on the right to water. And Alice Jennings was the lead attorney, and she was amazing during the trial. Rosalind Walker, Nicole, Nicole was one of the, Nicole Hill was one of the plaintiffs. It was an amazing trial. And when we brought in the experts, people were there. It was a trial that should have been televised. And it was a trial on the right to water. And it was dramatic testimony on the effects of shutoff on people. And it was an amazing trial. Actually, what brought the water issue into the bankruptcy is interesting too. One day, during the bankruptcy, to try to open up the process, we would sign up any Detroiter who was interested to become an objector, so you can intervene. Oh, there's Rosalind, who was part of that trial. Hi, Rosalind.
Hi. Hey, Jerry.
Welcome.
Hey, Valerie Jane.
Yeah, well, you should say a few words, and I'll finish in just a minute. But we opened up the issue. We had about 600 people, rank and file people, sign up to be objectors during the bankruptcy, because we wanted to take it away from just being something for lawyers to put the rank and file in it. And Rhodes actually had a couple of days where he invited objectors to give them about 3 to 5 minutes each to talk about why their objection was. And one of those days, Chris Hamel got up, and she gave a great talk and talked about the water shutoffs and the swaps, said it all. And she blew away Rhodes so much that he immediately ordered the water department to bring its officials in to talk about the shutoffs. And that weekend, a bunch of us got together and filed a class action lawsuit to intervene. But it was actually brought in by Chris. I'm very proud of that. She brought it into the bankruptcy and forced Rhodes to make it an issue. The trial, as powerful as that trial was, the water department tried to say they had all these ways to get around the shutoffs, but Rhodes actually rejected them. And Rhodes ultimately ruled at the end of that hearing that there's no question that water shutoffs create irreparable harm. And we were asking for an injunction. And so one of the standards is whether it creates irreparable harm. He said there's no question that water shutoffs create irreparable harm. That when someone's shut off for any period of time, that harm cannot be made up. It creates a health crisis, creates it creates what he described as irreparable. And he conceded that. But he Go ahead.
He also knew that it was wrong, and in so many ways he wanted to side with us, but I guess it was so much pressure, and you would call it peer pressure on that judge, that he had to side with the corporate people, if I could say it like that.
Well, and that's exactly what he did. His ruling actually has said that the harm to the city by not doing the shutoffs because of its effect on bondholders was a greater harm than the harm to people who had to live without water. He actually ruled that in the bankruptcy. And boy, if that doesn't say it all about capitalism, that does. When I was on tour in Puerto Rico, I would bring that up. And I just reviewed the decision. That's exactly what he ruled. So
when he at the early in the morning when the kids were going in to wash their clothes and take a shower and brush their teeth because they couldn't do it at home. I don't know how these people sleep at night. I know the story inside out, and every time it's still so infuriating. So
infuriating. Cut you in the heart and stick you in the back because
traumatized. I ain't never been the same.
And I know a lot of people and a lot of young kids are terrified of living without water, and they're to the age now where it's like maybe this happened 6-7 years ago, but they still traumatized from it, and they always worry about that. And when you have that on your mind all the time, how can you relax and learn as a student in school or college, in high school, college, or whatever? It's, really hard for a child to have to focus. And Judge Rowe, he talked to me a lot, and I tried to explain to him. And a lot of times when we was at that round table, he would say he wanted to hear from me, and I would speak. And it was like if he was listening to me, but he really couldn't help us, which is sad.
And that's exactly right. It was such an eloquent trial, Rosalind and Nicole. It was an amazing trial. When we brought in, of course, the experts on the show, actually to show that a water affordability plan would have collected more revenue than otherwise. But but the bottom line, and it's a really important bottom line for people to understand, was the bottom line is the banks came first, and that's capitalism. And that's an important lesson. And that's what the lesson of that bankruptcy was. It really shed the light on how when push comes to shove, it really, as bad as Dugan, and we know Duggan is, and he's an agent of the big business. But the truth of the matter is the real rulers of the system are the banks and the capitalists. And whoever's in, they're going to manipulate until the people take power. And that's what this showed. And they don't care about water shutoffs, they don't care about unemployment, they don't care about our city, and they'll destroy. And they've done it all over the world. They do it with wars all over the world. And it's important to note too that this pattern of the banks really grabbing on to water systems it wasn't unique to Detroit. It's all over the country. And really, it's a worldwide phenomenon because part of the austerity that went on during the 90s and 2000s, when the banks were basically imposing their will on countries all over the world, saying, when wages went down and there would be unemployment, they said, countries had to survive. So they would take out loans. And the banks conditioned those loans on selling off assets, and water was a valuable asset to sell off. And it happened all over the world. Maud Barlow wrote a great paper that really the motor force on water privatization, and really most water systems have been privatized now, was the World Bank. So this wasn't unique to Detroit. The only other point I'll make is the GLWA was such a racist formation, was that all Detroit got for the GWS, for its biggest asset, the water department, that it gave up, was it got them taking over the bonds, and also it got that they make a $50 million payment to a lease payment to the city every year. 13 million of that's paid from the city revenues, where really they should have paid $2 or $3 billion to the city for the water department. It was a robbery. And it was a robbery engineered by Orr, by the emergency management, Snyder, and really with the collusion of Duggan and really all the city officials. Honestly, they went along with it. And that's important to note too. It was formed out of robbery, and we should keep that in mind.
It was robbery, highway robbery at that.
That's right.
Well, they knew that they couldn't just take it, so they had to figure out a way to do it. And they did.
Right. Exactly right.
And you see it all over the world that they use water against us that way, right?
Exactly right. I mean,
and that's why the city looks like it does, with all the houses are still, just
your video, Roz, your video's off.
Well, I want to pay tribute to activists like yourself who defended your neighborhood against the water shutoffs, from Valerie to Rosalind to Nicole, the wonderful activists that brought this struggle. And really, one of the hiding parts of the water struggle was when we brought in the welfare rights, brought in the rapporteur on water for the UN. And I'll never forget what she said. She said, she traveled all over the world, and she can understand in a poor country, in an underdeveloped country, for people not having water, but to come to Michigan and see it, she said, I forgot what the word was. She used a great word, but basically she said it just showed the collapse of the system.
Right.
I forgot. The word is blanking me, but it was such a great word that it's just a complete contempt that capitalism has.
Yeah, they were great. They were great.
They
I
were great.
I loved it when Duggan was so mad because they were here,
That's
and
right.
she looked and said, "I'm not concerned with you, or your, or if you want me here or not." She was just like, I'm not concerned with how you feel about this. I was just like, she snapped right back at him. It was one of the greatest moments ever.
That's right.
Ever.
It sure was. Sure was.
Well, we got 4 minutes. Can you wrap it up for us and
I just want to say that I want to
Okay.
appreciate the opportunity. I never tire of talking about the banks, and to all the young, especially the young activists that are getting involved now, which is so refreshing. I just want to say, always look at what's behind the real core of the problem. And as bad as an individual politician or an individual racist pig cop might be, look at the system, because we live in a system where people mean nothing. Profit means everything. And our fight really for the basic human rights of the people is a fight to challenge the core of the system, to say we need a system based on human needs, not on profit. And that's really at the core of it. And Detroit, if any city has shown that, it's Detroit. And we really symbolize that. And we need to keep bringing it back and educating our people so we can move the fight forward in a way that can really change things, to create a world. Hey, we're at a point now where the existence of humanity depends on that kind of world. All this, what's going on with climate change, it's just so destructive. So that's really my message. And that's why I never tire about talking about this, because we want to educate the young people who didn't see we were a great city. We were such a great city, and they destroyed our neighborhoods. We didn't, and we need to build it back. One of the things I believe really the proposal being, and also there's going to be a referendum on putting reparations on. But when I view reparations, of course, it goes back to what they did during slavery, but they owe us reparations, Detroit reparations. The banks owe reparations for the destruction they caused in Detroit and every black city. They wiped out 50% of black wealth based on foreclosures from 2005, 2010. And make no mistake, these same banks were part of the slave trade. So I like the idea that we're raising reparations, because we demand billions of dollars from these banks to not be put in the hands of administration when none of it gets to the people, put it in the hands of the workers in the community so we can rebuild Detroit, restore our city to what it needs to be, restore our neighborhoods, and put it in the hands of the people. And I think that's an important fight in the years to come. So I want to really thank you for this opportunity. I always love having a chance to talk with you, and it's just so wonderful to speak with activists like yourself and Rosalind. And
Jerry, this conversation is so important, and in the next few months, I hope that we get to have it over and over and over again, and the people at the table gets larger and larger, so that we can really, really have it, and people can have an understanding of it. Because this is the important part of the story people don't understand.
Right.
And they need to, so that we can fight forward, so we can move forward and actually do all the things that you just spoke of. And it has to happen. Like you said, our lives depend on it. They really do. They really do. Well, thank you so much for all that you do, and for being here. And we're going to have you back in the next couple months and talk about kind of what's happening, keeping people abreast of what's happening behind closed doors here in Detroit. Thank you so much. I appreciate you. I can't see you, Rosalind, but thank you so much for you joined just in the right time to be able to kind of talk about what happened with the bankruptcy. Always thank you, Lou, for doing our tech. I appreciate you. Everybody else will be back next Wednesday. at noon. Please tune in and share this and leave some comments, and let's have a real conversation about it. Thank you so much, Jerry.
Thank you so much. My honor to be with you all. It was always wonderful to be with activists like yourself and Rosalind and Lou, and just a pleasure.